All right, guys, welcome to the FYD podcast. I'm here with author Amy Neumann. Now, she has 5,000 different titles. Do-gooder is definitely one of them. She's really prolific in the tech community, but also in the philanthropic community. And I'm going to let you do a much better introduction of yourself and kind of give us a little bit of a backstory of really how you came to be in all the different positions that you're in today.
Sure. So I guess I happened to fall into the internet in the mid-90s and just started at a good time and saw it do remarkable things. At the same time, I've always been very interested in volunteering and philanthropy. And so over many years, and living in Los Angeles for 16 years and working at AT&T and Yahoo and at the rise and the fall of the .com heyday, in different aspects of technology, I started to see patterns that anytime something new comes along that creates some sort of a seismic shift, it also creates a lot of opportunity for good. Mm-hmm. And so I just sort of happened into it and saw cool things happen. I saw the same thing with social media. And then when I started seeing things about blockchain and artificial intelligence, it piqued my interest even more because it felt exactly to me like it felt in the mid-90s before everyone sort of believed the internet would catch on. Okay. People would tell me that they didn't need an email because they had a fax machine, and they didn't think it would catch on. It did catch on, turns out.
Absolutely, yeah. It wasn't just for creeps on the internet.
And there's actually a lot of good use cases already in technology, emerging technology for good, but I'm just sort of obsessed with it. So I like to sort of keep tabs on what's new and, like a detective, try to crack the code on what the potential could be.
Sure, and when you're looking at, I guess, these technologies, are you looking at them from a ultra techie point of view, or are you're really bent on how do we use these for philanthropic, or how do we help people with these?
Sure. That's a great question, because a lot of people, I think, get thrown off by the technology piece. Mm-hmm. And I like to say that I don't know how electricity works, but I like light.
Sure.
And I don't know how most of the apps on my phone work either, but I can tell you exactly what they do and why I like them. And basically what they do for me, or what they do in general. And I think a lot of people get thrown off because it's like asking someone to describe the coding behind an app. Mm-hmm. Hardly anyone knows that, and it doesn't matter. And so I think technology is a lot like that. I'm looking at the use cases, how it can be applied, the cool stuff it can do, and examples of how it's actually making impact. Mm-hmm. I like the technology piece. I know you like the technology piece, but I would say that's a smaller percentage of people. And I don't think you need to have a deep understanding of it. You just have to work with people who know enough if you're trying to develop something that they can tell you whether it's possible or not possible.
Right, and one of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about, especially because you just spoke at the Amplify event, and it was very blockchain and AI heavy, is, I guess, how do you view those two kind of commingling and combining? Because, and this is coming from somebody that very clearly is a fan of all those buzzwords, but I think we have some level of neural networks and cryptocurrencies, kind of like AI and blockchain. But how do you see them meshing?
Well, I think of blockchain, I guess, a little bit more like a infrastructure, and I think it's changing a lot of things where trust is required. Mm-hmm. For example, in the late 90s, I thought it would be cool to be able to make a donation directly to someone in another country, a small donation, and it was very hard because you didn't know who that person was. There wasn't a way to do it. So something like blockchain, since you don't need a third party to create trust, you can do that. But I think that is more like an infrastructure layer. And then a lot of the interesting things that tie on top of that are more in the AI space. So an example that I hear a lot, you probably heard too, is some parts of this are already working, but you could have a self-driving car that is not owned by anybody. It's owned by itself, basically. It pays its own lease. It pays its own insurance. It goes to the gas station or the charging station, hopefully, in the middle of the night, charges up, picks up people on a schedule in the morning. People get in, recognizes their face using AI. They pay with cryptocurrency on the blockchain, and it's all sort of seamlessly integrated. So I think it's like a lot of things that we do on our phones now or on the internet, where it's early now. It's only been around 10 years, blockchain, for example. AI's been around 40 years.
Yeah, longer than that, depending on what your definition is. Yeah.
But a lot of the coolest stuff has only become recently possible. So I think that as that continues, it's going to be sort of a merging of both things. So people talk a lot about the technology of blockchain, I think because it's newer, and a lot of the applications are still being tested and things, but that'll fall off. You already start hearing about blockchain being referred to as DLT, or distributed ledger technology, because people are trying to take it into, I guess, the use cases and the things it can do a little bit more, and I think they'll be more and more integrated.
Do you worry that interest in blockchain is kind of waning in the same way? So I look at the blockchain hype as very similar to the IoT hype, right? And that's Internet of Things. It happens to be one of the buzzwords you are not using, which I suggest hop on that buzzword. It's thoroughly good. But like 5 years ago, IoT was it, right? And now it's kind of turned into edge computing, fog computing, which is all still within that realm of what IoT is. But we're not talking about IoT nearly as much as these conferences, right? And do you fear that's kind of what's happening to blockchain, or do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's kind of a good thing. So you don't hear about IoT or the Internet of Things, but you hear about all the things on the internet and what they're doing, right? So a self-driving car is a thing that's on the internet, but I don't know that people talk about it like that because people are more familiar with what it means. Like 5 years ago, if you said IoT, most people blank stares.
Sure.
And I think blockchain is still a little bit like that in a lot of circles, but I think that as more people get comfortable with it, the buzzwords fade off a little bit, but the cool stuff it actually does remains.
Right, and so it's interesting because I have a hard time combining the two, and I talk about it a little bit in that book, but really more so now it's kind of, there really isn't much to sort, right? And there's really not much that, I mean, AI can help accelerate some parts of maybe like the Lightning Network, and I don't think that's really true, but there's really not a good mesh between the two. And I look at blockchain really as almost like a software language. It's a way to do a database. And my main concern, especially, and I'm on the hype train too, but my main concern is that we're very frequently in a lot of these blockchain use cases trying to jam a square peg in a round hole, whereas we could be doing probably better use cases when we're trying to look at some blockchain. So when you're looking at blockchain, what are some of the use cases that you're excited about?
Yeah, and you make up a really good point. I think that whenever I have a conversation with somebody and they say they want to use fill in the blank.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I say, okay, that could be an option. Let's back it up a little bit. What challenge are you trying to solve? Because really there's usually many ways to solve any challenge. Technology can commonly be one of them, and that can take a lot of forms. But if somebody says, so what happens a lot is somebody will go attend a conference, for example, and they hear the term blockchain a lot, and they'll get excited because it does a lot of cool stuff. And they'll say, we need to use blockchain. And that's kind of the opposite approach that I would take.
Right.
I would say, okay, what's a pain point we haven't been able to solve yet?
Right. Well, that's like saying, like, I love cement. I'm going to build with cement. I'm like, well, what are you going to build? They're like, it doesn't matter, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a really good example. I was totally stealing that.
Take it.
But yeah, so I hear a lot of people say, well, we have to use AI.
Right.
Use AI is not really a thing that you do. You solve a problem with a technology, and it could be AI, it could be blockchain, it could be something that already exists, it could be something not technical. A lot of times it has to do with asking more questions and getting more people involved for their opinions earlier in the process, for example. But I think that some of the things that I get excited about are things that didn't exist before blockchain. Like a big one is being able to provide payments to people that you've never met before. So this is a really big deal because there are about 2 billion people in the world who are unbanked or underbanked. There's even a large percentage of people right here in Cleveland, Ohio, who are unbanked or underbanked. And that means that they can't get a credit card or a checking account, or they are doing transactions on a cash basis or so small in other countries that they just can't get a bank interested enough because the way the infrastructure is set up in the banking system today is very slow, cumbersome, takes a long time, it's expensive the way it's set up. So things like remittances to other countries you hear about a lot. There's already organizations who are charging about 2% versus the traditional more like 10%. Some of the larger well-known organizations do if you're trying to take money that you earned here and send it to another country, for example. I think peer-to-peer energy trading is very interesting.
Okay, yeah. That's
So,
a good one. Yeah, you don't hear that often.
Well, I think, and that sounds like a really boring term, but basically, a lot of the world is using clean energy already. A lot of the technology exists and it's being used every day.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is higher adoption some places and lower adoption some places.
Mm-hmm.
But things like microgrids, which are popping up a lot in places like India, for example, in towns that don't have electricity at all, are also valuable here. So if you have a microgrid, you don't have to be attached to the traditional energy companies' infrastructure. And you could have solar panels, for example, on roofs in a bunch of apartments. And then if you're out of town for 2 weeks and I have a big family that needs extra energy that I'm not getting from my solar panel, I can use yours. And we can kind of have a little self-sufficient microgrid that runs that way. And you can track all of that on blockchain. And I think that although there is a project in Brooklyn that's experimenting with that, I think that's going to be a big deal globally, and I'm happy to see that trend.
Mm-hmm.
I think anytime that you need to have trust that doesn't exist already is a good example. One of the things in the philanthropy space would be tracking donations and seek the impact. So there's an organization out of the UK called Alice that is tracking money that you give to help homeless people kind of all the way through the process.
Mm-hmm.
And people are working on smart contracts, which is a way that you set something up so there's not really human intervention. But for example, if I have a big grant I want to give to a nonprofit,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to make it sort of so they don't have to wait to get big pieces of it. They can hit milestones where they
Mm-hmm.
achieve certain goals and impacts and automatically get money for the next phase.
Yeah, and I think that's a real good kind of example of where smart contracts make sense in kind of in lieu of that centralized party.
Right.
Now, I do think that we're kind of moving more and more towards some pseudo blockchains where there is a centralized party, and certainly
For sure.
that's what banks want. They want something that's somewhere in between, which I think it will probably be unsuccessful long term, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. I guess where I fall on a lot of that is I think that the money-based things like lotteries, I think lotteries would be great for blockchains, cryptocurrencies, things like that. Where I tend to fall short are on some of these like auditing procedures, because you don't necessarily want your auditing to be completely transparent either, right? You don't want it to be tampered with, but I mean, at a certain point, you're almost better off using a really secure database. But I wanted to add, so an interesting intersection. So I do a lot with nonprofits also, particularly on the data security side. And so like with healthcare, you have patient information. With manufacturing, you typically have trade secrets or your AutoCAD files and whatnot. With banks, you have financial. With nonprofits, you have donor data, and that's really what's being heavily targeted.
Right.
And I feel like nonprofits, more so than any of the other industries, are really under funded as when it comes to cybersecurity or technology.
Any technology.
Is that kind of what you're seeing, or what do you see in terms of trends as far as like nonprofits in general?
Well, I think nonprofits, in my experience, tend to be a little behind the curve. So anytime a new technology comes out, corporations, any place there's an opportunity to make a lot of money, corporations tend to gravitate there first, and they'll create things that can then be used by the nonprofit sector. A good example right now is in blockchain. You have the shipping company Maersk that's, I hope I pronounced that right, that's working with other shipping companies because the shipping industry is very paper-based and nobody really exactly knows a lot of times when the container's there, what's in it, where, it's very, I try not to use the word old-fashioned so much. I call it traditional.
Okay.
It's very
conservative.
Traditional.
Yeah.
And so they've taken to putting a lot of the logistics into supply chain, because what happens then is instead of having 50 different shipping companies arranging their own paper and then trying to figure things out like that, everybody can go in and look at the same thing. It's time stamped. Everyone can agree where it is. This is great for tracking any sort of supply chain stuff. You hear a lot about that. Great. So there's the corporate use case. Then you head on over to the nonprofit and you can do the same thing with donations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a lot of countries where there's governments who may not be as truthful as you would like them to be. An example that you'll hear sometimes is in Honduras. They had some issues with governmental change, and then whoever had a land deed, for example, they would show them and they'd say, oh, that's funny, it doesn't match up. Our computer says that my friend owns that land.
Sure.
So another type of supply chain use case would be for land rights. So there a couple different organizations around the world are taking pictures, doing GPS coordinates, talking to neighbors, going back in history, and once everybody sort of agrees that a certain entity owns the land, they lock it in. And then everyone can look at it and agree, so that if something happens, it's there at a certain point in time that everyone had agreed upon it. I think that's really cool, because if you have land but you can't prove it, you can't get a loan, you don't have that equity, you can't pass it on to someone, can't develop it or do anything else with it. So that's about 70% of the world doesn't have stable, agreed upon documentation that they own their land, and I think that's a huge use case that has potential benefit.
Yeah. As far as nonprofits adopting I guess let me rephrase this a different way. So I get frustrated frequently when I'm working with nonprofits and they are using technology that's built for nonprofits, but that technology is really just a really bare bones version of something that's better for for-profits.
Right.
And so what's coming to mind is that I don't even remember what the name of the CRM was, but it was a very stripped version of like a CRM machine, but for donors. So instead of saying these are my customers, these are my donors, I'm like, just use Salesforce. Call them customers. Like, you're not doing yourself any service by calling them donors and using a clearly worse version for what you're doing, right? And I see that so often, and more and more often you have these custom apps that are just not secure.
Right.
And then their donor data is open to the public, and then everyone can see, Joe Bag of Donuts gave them $1 million last year, and here's his address.
Right.
Right. And I guess do you worry about that with AI and blockchain or any of these other emerging technologies you see nonprofits starting to dabble in?
Again, I would say what I usually tell nonprofits when they're looking at technology is a little bit like what you just said. It doesn't have to be nonprofit technology.
Right.
It just has to be something that solves whatever problem that you have. And a lot of times there's a good business solution, and you can contact them and they'll give you a nonprofit rate. And then you can use it. It doesn't really have to be labeled something specifically. And there are specific things that some CRM systems do for nonprofits because they're, the lingo's different, but you could kind of put the words back and forth, right? Donor, customer, client.
Yeah. I was working with one in particular, and they were just like, well, they're not customers, they're donors. Like, listen, just call them whatever you want.
You label it how you want. It just has to have certain things, like there's certain things that you would do as a nonprofit that you wouldn't do the same way as a corporation.
Yeah.
But you can sometimes use the same technology and relabel it or something
Customize
like that.
the fields, yeah.
I think I'm glad you brought up databases, because I think one of the killer applications for nonprofits will be AI. AI is great at seeing patterns that humans can't see. And so when you have, that's what data science is. It's very popular these days for that reason. So I think if you're a nonprofit, regardless of how you've been doing your data up to this point, it's going to be really valuable to you to do a good job of capturing more accurate data, putting in a secure system.
Sure.
And it could be a nonprofit system, or it could be a business system that you adopt as a nonprofit. But I think that if you have good data, then you can do a lot with it as far as artificial intelligence. You can go in and you can figure out if people have these certain interests, they tend to give more or less. If people go to these types of events, they tend to volunteer more or less. And once you can start seeing patterns, then you can go and customize sort of your story so that it resonates better with people.
Absolutely.
And as you get better with that, then you're going to have more people volunteering and advocating for you and giving you money, time, being board members, whatever you're looking for.
I've been on record many times here saying that AI, at this point, this stage of AI, its best application is sorting, right? Because we have all these sensors, we have all this data that we are collecting that we just can't do anything with because there's just too much of it and we don't know where to start. And that's really where, the A/B testing with predictive analytics, or to some extent machine learning, I suppose, that's really the best application that I see businesses using today. Now tomorrow, I'm sure that we'll get closer to AI doing more structured or automated tasks, but the sorting is here now.
Yeah.
And I'm a big proponent of like, use what we have now. Let's stop pontificating about what we might have.
Dream big, but actually get some stuff done.
Right. And I think that's another big problem with nonprofits, where like every once in a while I see one take a risk, and because there's not a lot of money they're working with typically, they'll take that risk and it'll be a big risk,
Right.
And
Yeah.
it'll blow up, and they're like, well, I'm not doing that anymore.
And then it kind of sets the whole thing back. So I am definitely love risk. I like to move
Sure.
fast and break things.
Yeah, I'm ready to
Fix
shoot
it,
aim.
break it again.
Yeah.
And I think if we're talking about AI, another easy thing that people can do today is an AI chatbot. And so I had an organization here locally that was really excited about this because they get a lot of the same questions. So they have staff people answering the same questions over and over and over. And so even something very simple that isn't hard to set up, that's AI based, can answer questions in a way that feels warm and friendly to people. Some organizations are experimenting with getting small donations, capturing email addresses, routing people to different locations, letting people know when certain services are available, things like that. I suppose you could use it for any number of things, and a lot of organizations do. But that actually exists today. There's an organization for nonprofits called Bots for Charity, and you can go, they made very sophisticated templates, and you can go use them for free. And so that's something that could save your staff time immediately today.
Yeah, no, big fan of chatbots too when I'm implementing them. Sometimes I don't want to talk to a chatbot, but
it depends on how they're set up. Like any technology, right? You can take a technology. You have to think through, what are you trying to do? It's more so than what is the technology.
Anytime I'm talking to a chatbot, it's almost always a crisis, and I want a person. But
you have a negative association.
Right. Yeah, my bias is pretty heavy there. With it having been said, I've implemented more than one in my lifetime, so we'll see. So you've given me a book.
Yes.
Thank you. One, I appreciate it. But tell me about what inspired you to write the book, and a little bit more about it in general, so that other people can potentially get the book.
Sure. So the book is called Simple Acts to Change the World, 500 Ways to Make a Difference. It's from Simon Schuster, Adams Media. And I guess I've been accumulating ways to change the world for a really long time. And so I've interviewed lots of people. I really am interested in the intersection of social good and technology in particular, or tech for impact. So I've talked to a lot of people about that. I've done a lot of volunteering. I just ask people a lot of questions. And it turns out there's a lot of smart people in the world sharing ideas and stuff on social media, on the internet. So after accumulating all these ideas for a really long time and writing about them, Simon & Schuster actually contacted me to write it, which I was very surprised by.
Oh, wow. That's a great compliment.
I don't know that happens a lot, but they have Adams Media looks for people who have sort of niche experience, and kind of like a network of people that share that love of that topic. And so a lot of people, it turns out, are really interested in changing the world. So it was really, really fun to write and figure out different categories of ideas. There are some technology things in there. There are things to do with kids, great ways for people with disabilities to help, things to do with groups, business organizations, ways to increase diversity and inclusion and reduce bias, and a lot of other things, just simple little things though. I did join the Peace Corps in there, but because I had to, because people kept telling me to. That would be a little bit more long term. A lot of these are just a couple minutes.
Tiny things you can do that if everyone did one of them a day would make a significant impact on the world.
Yeah, just thinking about things a little bit more. Like a big one that anyone can do at any time is just ask more questions. Ask people what they want. Like as a nonprofit, sometimes you may have been on a project that did something a certain way and it worked really great. And it might work really great again in a certain other time and space. Or another idea would be to ask people, what have they tried? What do they like? What would they like? What ideas do they have? People are incredibly smart and creative. And sometimes they just don't get an opportunity to share that if you don't ask. So asking more questions before you take action is one of my favorite ways to change the world.
Yeah, I think that's solid advice from a technical perspective and from a non-technical perspective, right?
Applies to everything.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what's true is true across categories, right? So I think that's cool that you've captured a lot of those things. Since you've published the book, do you have the urge to publish another one?
Well, yes, I do. And it's funny because a long time ago, I ran a marathon, and I knew as I was training that I probably wasn't going to enjoy the actual running part. And
Yeah.
that's very true. So I knew, and I've written I write a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started writing this book, I thought, because it was a pretty condensed timeline, and I thought, I don't know, there's going to be some point where it's going to be like mile 20.
Sure.
And then I also, similar to when I ran a marathon, it fades, and then you go right back in for the punishment again. So yeah, I have a couple books in mind that I want to write, and I would like to really start writing a little bit more about emerging technologies for good,
Mm-hmm.
and how emerging technologies can reduce bias.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are some risks and opportunities always with technology, and I think one of the risks right now with I would say blockchain and AI, but AI in particular, is that a lot of the people working on it are a homogenous group, and again, it goes back to thinking about being inclusive and things like that. So one of the ideas in the book that I talk about too is to just be mindful if you have an event or a board of directors or a product development team or a group of volunteers, whatever it is, just make sure that all viewpoints and different backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds and other types of diversity are included, because I've heard some stories of just blind spots that people had, and they would release a product, for example,
Right.
that really missed the mark, and they could have easily, to another group of people, would have been very obvious not to do certain things. So for me, that's a big one, because I want to make sure that people don't get written out of code.
Mm-hmm.
You know, huge swaths of the globe don't get missed.
Right.
Because it was programmed, you know, with a certain mindset in mind, and not necessarily thinking about multiple things.
And so, no, I mean that's really eloquently put. And you said that you want to remove bias against technologies.
That's a good question. To clarify, as an example, a lot of the data sets that AI is trained on are already biased in and of themselves. So before anything gets coded, the data that's being used is already biased. Okay, and that may or may not be something a lot of people know or recognize.
It's a problem in cybersecurity when you're doing algorithms for that, because they think that you can exploit those biases.
Right.
But when you first said that, I was like, which chapter is about how Michael Hudak has a bias against chatbots and how to solve that?
Not against technology.
Yeah, and I'm like, wow, this is already, I'm helping you write this book right now. Case study 1.
Hold on, let's take some.
Yeah, all right. He does not like chatbots. How do we fix this?
No, I think technology is just an extension of humans. You know, people like, I talk a lot about social media, for example, and all the cool, great things that it can do for nonprofits. And all social media is an extension of what humans have been doing since the dawn of time, communicating and sharing with each other.
Yeah.
And I think all technology is an extension of humans, which can be good,
right,
or it can be bad, because if you have a group of humans creating it that may have biases they're not even aware of, then that's going to come through in any technology. Well, and so that's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
and do you worry about, on the social media front, the algorithm in general, and kind of who controls the narrative of news, and then, you know, there's a thing that came out that Facebook has people whose entire lives are just centered around making you keep scrolling. Like, how do we get their attention focused on this timeline as much as we can?
I think all technology is a bit of a double-edged sword.
Sure.
So I would say the echo chamber effect is strong and dramatic, and it's polarizing, and I don't think any of those things are great. I think you really have to go out of your way to figure out how to keep it from being an echo chamber. So I think a lot of times, you know, people that travel a lot, or people that have had a chance to meet a lot of different types of people in their lives, tend to have less stereotypes sometimes than people who haven't, because
they just haven't experienced as much.
They haven't experienced as much. And I think you don't experience as much in the same way if you keep clicking on the same things on social media, you'll keep seeing more of the same. And so it's like talking to a small group of people your whole life that have the same viewpoints as you.
Right.
It just doesn't give you a chance to hear other things. So I don't love that about social media. I will say some of the things I do like about social media, though, on the flip side, are that you can find people all over the world who are as passionate about something as you are from a nonprofit perspective. So I've done fundraising on every continent except Antarctica.
Right.
We'll work on it.
That's next.
Next book idea.
Yeah.
And it's just from finding hashtags or other things that before Twitter, for example, I would have no way of knowing these people existed on these other continents, right? So it's got very positive impacts as well.
Yeah. I mean, the power of just connecting to people you never thought you could have connected to as well.
Yeah. So if you take advantage of that, and so I think it's just can be dangerous if you don't give it thought. It's just going to start amplifying whatever you already think and whatever the people closest to you already think, which could be fine. But I think if you look at how big the world is and how diverse the ideas are and how different people are, if you kind of try to reach out and poke around a little bit more, it's just way more interesting.
Yeah, I think the world is generally a better place than a lot of people think.
I agree.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, this is kind of a weird, there's no real segue to this, but it's data privacy has been a big thing on my list. I'm slowly shifting away from my favorite buzzwords and moving into some new exciting ones. And I'm kind of seeing what Google's doing, I'm kind of seeing what Facebook's doing. I guess what are your general viewpoints, and do you have a lot of any thoughts on it?
So data privacy. Well, I guess from being in marketing and communications a long time, I have mixed feelings about it because I think that knowing more about people allows you to connect more specifically with people that might really enjoy what you want to talk about. But one of the big use cases of blockchain that you hear about is people owning their own identity, which I agree with. And
well, you're still broadcasting that though, because
right.
anyone could see the ledger to some extent, right?
Right.
So.
Well, I think we'll see how that morphs, but I think that the idea is that at some point you will, it's kind of like behind a little bit of a closed door, and you just let people peek into the one part you want instead of, if you still have to take your birth certificate and things sometimes on papers. It's just very not secure from
sure.
Every
time I have my birth certificate, I get mugged. It's weird.
But I think if you can put it someplace where, just from a sheer convenience, not even necessarily data privacy, but it would be nice if you owned your own identity and could just let people verify something without even necessarily having to see everything.
Right.
Although I think of it like how easy is that going to be for the average person to want to manage? And that's where people are going to come in and step in and fix, come up with ways to solve that. But right now, I think that that's the biggest question is it's like if you own Bitcoin and you lose the key, you're out of luck. And I wouldn't want somebody to have that happen with their identity. And I know that there's a lot of people working on how to make that happen. And a lot of it goes back to decentralizing or centralizing something that is trying to be decentralized. So there's a lot of back and forth happening right now in that space, and I think rightfully people should own their own identity. That hasn't been how it's been set up to date, so there's going to be a little bit of a struggle trying to get it to a place where people feel comfortable maybe owning more of their data or protecting more of their data or being compensated for sharing their data is another idea that people have. Yeah,
I think the biggest you brought up blockchain. The biggest problem with blockchain, and as far as any application, is the user experience, because it's just garbage. Even the best, like Coinbase, I guess, is the easiest. It's still not easy. It's not.
And it's centralized.
Right. If you can't teach your grandma how to do it, then it's not going to be adopted mainstream. Is my opinion. But when you're looking at data privacy, keeping your data private is just not a good user experience because you can't interact with things. Right, and we've, Facebook certainly I think has started that culture, maybe Google, but of just somebody else owns your identity and it's you. Because really before Facebook, I thought everyone was kind of on the avatar bandwagon where I wasn't Michael Hudak, I was M Hudak, whatever, that was my screen name. And so you had that level of security in that, you know. But now it's all you have to have your real birthday. They double check things. Even Coinbase, like, they need an ID, right?
Yeah, and I think that takes some of the beauty out of the original idea of blockchain. I think the scary part about digital identity is your digital identity knows a lot more detail about your life than you do. So every time that you have your phone with you and you're going places, there's ways for lots of entities to know about that. When things are connected to your credit cards, your grocery store cards, every data point, everything you search, everything you do on social media,
everything's stored.
Every place you've been, like I could ask you what you did 6 months ago at this time on a certain day. You wouldn't know.
But my phone absolutely knows.
But other entities know. And so I think that is the part that is offers some opportunities in some ways, but is terrifying in other ways. And that has been how it's been, but I would argue that it probably won't be how it continues to be, because it doesn't need to be anymore. I think blockchain is probably going to change that. And I think about in the mid-90s, again, when I first started using email, I think it was a 2600 baud connection, which is 2.6K, I think. So it took 45 minutes to upload from my computer to an email a one-page Excel spreadsheet.
I believe it.
As a time, to give you an idea. And now you can do things instantaneously, almost anything. So right now we're at the 56K version of the internet connectivity. And, you know, at that point people said, well, there's no way you could stream videos. I used to work with entertainment clients in Los Angeles studios in the late 90s who were FedExing dailies to edit back and forth to different parts. Because you couldn't do that on a connection. And now that seems funny because you're like, well, obviously, you know, we would talk about it and they'd say, I don't think that's going to happen.
People don't remember how, like, significant GIFs were.
Right.
When the first GIFs came, I was like, wow, whoa, this picture moves? What are we doing? This is space? What is this? You know? Yeah,
and I think so. Ray Kurzweil is a writer who writes a lot about AI. And he has something he calls the law of accelerated return. So when they were working on computers and vacuum tubes and making them smaller and smaller, it got to a point where everyone's like, well, obviously they can't get smaller. And that's true, but the whole paradigm shifts. And then they move on to other things. And once that starts to reach what people consider to be, oh, it can't get any better than it is now, something else, a new paradigm shifts, and the money goes into funding that. And that's how you get, now that you can, you know, on Netflix, you can stream something instantaneously. And if you would have asked people in the mid-90s what they thought about that,
there was
cell phones weren't even, like, you didn't have smartphones or iPads or anything, so people would say, oh, that could never happen. That could never happen based on that current paradigm. That's true. But I think that if you, time and time again, that all changes. That's why I don't get as nervous as some of the people who talk about AI taking all the jobs and things.
I hope. I don't want to work.
That's right. Well, you know, you do, like, Kai-Fu Lee's book, AI Superpowers, towards the end. I think people have a lot more free time, right? But I think that people are very smart and creative, and they start to see that there could be potentially a new paradigm. And then somebody will get super excited about it, start working on it, and a lot of people will say, why are you bothering with that? That can't be done. And then those are the people who do it, the people who ignore the people who say it can't be done, and then we enter into this new world where we're doing stuff that we couldn't do. Whatever we're thinking about doesn't seem likely right now with AI or blockchain. You fast forward 10 years and it'll be a quaint conversation.
Absolutely. And yeah, you know, it's funny, I remember all the pushback from Netflix originally. It's like, you don't want to own your movies? And now it's like, no, God, I don't want to own anything, you know? So certainly that's shifted, and society kind of morphs a lot. And I also believe that in general we are much more interested in being progressive. I think that as far as, like, technology goes, not like politically, like when we see new technology, we're a lot more open-minded. I don't see even people that are pessimistic or kind of down on blockchain, they're still like, well, let's see where this goes. Like, I'll still encourage the exploration of that. And I think that that's huge. And I think that that's one of the things I really enjoy about the era that I get to be alive in, because that was certainly not the case in the 80s and the 90s. So.
And I think we've seen so many things change so fast that we know it's possible. And even if we can't figure out how to do it right now, we know that one of the dots is going to So you have a lot of these half ideas floating around, as I like to think of it, and then you have another conversation with what this other person has the other half of it, and boom, now you got a working idea. And I think that, like you said, we live in a time where people think a lot of things are possible because they are, and they've been proven to be over and over and over.
Yeah.
So even in the past, if something seemed unrealistic, I don't think people view things quite like that because technology changes so fast. So, a couple hundred years ago, things didn't change very fast. And so maybe it wasn't possible to do all these crazy things. But today it changes so fast that, quantum computing opens up massive opportunities.
Yeah.
And who knows what else? Space exploration. So many things, right?
We just got to the moon, relative to being alive as humans. Like, that wasn't that long ago. It's sad that we haven't been back, but it's fine. I'm real excited for the future.
Me too.
So as we're kind of wrapping up, what else do you want to plug? What else do you want to kind of bring up? What else should people know?
Well, I would just say to be open to new ideas in general. So that includes technology, but one of the my arch nemesis is status quo. And so I physically cringe when people say, well, it's been working great all this time, or that's just the way we do it, or anything like that. So I would just offer to start thinking about if you're in a group of people or you're saying that, I would take a step back and say, is there, it might be okay right now, but what else is happening that we could take advantage of to make it better? So I just don't think things stay static very long. I have seen a lot of people over a good chunk of time who said, well, we don't need to pay attention to whatever it is. We're fine. We've been doing business this way this long, and I've seen a lot of places come and go that way. And it's a missed opportunity to share their creativity with the world because they just didn't feel like they needed to pay attention. I think everybody should pay at least a little attention. And anytime you hear something related to status quo, the tighter people grab onto it, the more I would be worried.
Right.
And I would just start thinking, just bringing up conversations. Are there any problems we've been trying to solve for a long time that haven't gone the way we want? Are there any areas that we think we could improve? Are there any things we should stop doing, start doing? And just think about things earlier in the process, because I think that one of the things that I wish more nonprofits would do is just take a little bit more risk. I think now that the world is a much smaller place with all this technology, you have a lot of opportunities. So it's not just your neighborhood anymore, or your city, or the people that went to your college, or the people from your town. It's anybody who has any access to the internet could potentially be somebody you could work with as a nonprofit. So if you think about it like that, you can start thinking a lot bigger. And I think thinking bigger is always an opportunity.
Absolutely. So there you have it. Amy Neumann, diversity, the dynamic world of technology. Don't get stuck in your old ways.
Right.
Don't be biased against chatbots.
That's right. We'll figure out what books we're going to write next. It really was a pleasure writing the book. And I think that, I see you have yours too.
I do.
How did you find the experience? Did you like it as well, or did you get through that? Did you hit that wall and keep going, and then you were super high-fiving yourself at the end?
So I wrote the book really quickly, and I didn't have an issue with that. I had an issue finding an easy way to publish it and not have the content change, but that's actually, the book was the reason why I started the podcast, because things change so frequently that, there's parts of the book that already are slipping away, right? And I'm like, wow, that is not the way to go about it, right? Because I interviewed people in 2017 and wrote it in 2018, and it was published this year, and it's like, whoa, some of that information was what I thought in 2017.
Yeah. Which
2 years later, it kind of seems silly. So, the next book I write, I'm going to go about it very differently. And like I said, you went on concepts, real smart. I went really granular in the technology, and so it was a misplay. There was a misstep. I'm happy I made it, and I like this podcast much more than I like that book. But yeah, it was an interesting journey. And I think that trying to figure out how to make a timeless book would be the next challenge.
A timeless tech book would be...
It's basically impossible.
Yeah.
But I'll try it.
But yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations. That's very cool.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming on, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, thank you.